The first time I heard the words, "We lost everything because of you, Nia," they didn't sound like grief. They sounded like a warning. We were in courtroom 6B, air so cold it felt personal. The oak benches creaked under the weight of relatives and strangers, all pulled into the same undertow, a promise of guaranteed returns that had turned our savings to dust. Victor, my brother-in-law, stood at the witness rail with his jaw clenched tight, tie slightly askew, righteous fury painted on his face as if it had been rehearsed. He glared at me as if my name had cracked the floor. "You couldn't keep it in the family," he hissed, forgetting the microphone. "You had to run to regulators." To the press, the judge raised a hand. "Mr. Adebayo, control yourself." Behind me, Mama Amaka sobbed into a crumpled handkerchief. My husband Gabriel's fingers were cold around mine, squeezing once like a heartbeat learning courage again. On the prosecutor's table sat a neat stack of screenshots, contracts, wire slips, and a blue flash drive, the one I'd carried in my coat pocket for 2 months, like a talisman and a curse. I thought of the day Victor brought his glossy brochure into our dining room, smiled like a pastor, and spread graphs across our table. Silver Bay Capital insured high return notes, 18 to 24% APR, zero volatility. He said he had insider vetting, institutional partners, referral bonuses that go back to the family. He said safety so many times the word went numb. He kissed Mama's head and called her queen. He told me, "Nia, you're practical. You'll appreciate the due diligence." He never showed the risk memo that said, "pilot program, high redemption pressure." He never mentioned the referral contract that paid him per head. He did not tell us he was skimming performance fees ahead of distribution. He told us to trust we did. My siblings, my cousins, and Uncle Raymond, retirement funds and an old inheritance we'd promised to protect, pooled their money and placed it into the engine Victor revved. For a while, monthly statements glowed. Numbers climbed like vines on a sunny wall. People smiled longer at church. We slept better. Until one morning, the Silver Bay dashboard showed scheduled maintenance, then temporary withdrawal limits, then silence. Interest stopped. Redemption requests bounced. Victor said, "It's a market cycle. Don't panic. Liquidity windows reopen next quarter." He tapped the table and wouldn't meet my eyes. When I asked for the risk memo, he said it was proprietary. When I asked why he'd opened new accounts in 2 cousins' names without telling them, he laughed and said, "Administrative bundles." When I asked why payments had been split across 3 processors, he told me to stop acting like a cop. That night I couldn't sleep. I searched the fine print until the letters bled. I found a clause about reassignment of referral economics. I found a Shell LLC, Harbor Vista. Consulting, that shared Victor's P.O. box. I found a voice note he'd left in the family group chat months earlier, promising crisis-proof returns. I found my breath turning to ice. In court, the prosecutor held up a document. "Mr. Adebayo, is this your signature on the referral agreement with Silver Bay Capital?" Victor's mouth twitched. "I don't recall." "Is this your voice in these recordings, assuring investors their principal was insured?" "It's out of context." He turned back to me, eyes hard. "You went outside the family, Nia. You ruined us." I met his stare and, for the first time since the dashboard went dark, felt no fear. The truth was not a betrayal. It was a boundary. "I didn't ruin us," I said quietly. "Lies did." And for a heartbeat, just one, the whole room was silent enough to hear the sound of something breaking. Not me, not my family. A mask. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories coming soon. I remember the night Victor first walked into our dining room with that confident swagger, the one that always made people believe he had life figured out. He arrived with glossy brochures tucked under his arm, a brand new suit, and a salesman's sparkle in his eye. He hugged Mama Amaka, clapped Gabriel on the back, and kissed me on the cheek like we were partners in some great adventure. We had no idea we were about to walk into a nightmare. "Nia," he said, unfolding the first chart on our table. "This is the opportunity we've all been waiting for. It's called Silver Bay Capital, It's not some fly-by-night scam. This is institutional. Guaranteed 18 to 24% annual returns. Risk is practically zero. The word guaranteed should have been my first red flag. But Victor had always been the golden boy, the one who turned every venture into profit. And he wasn't just talking to me. Around the table sat our entire family. Mama Amaka, Aunt Beatrice, Uncle Raymond, my cousins, and a few close family friends. Even my former college roommate Naya had shown up. All of them listened, rapt as he spoke. He promised monthly statements, insured principal, and special family-only referral bonuses. He said he had insider access through a friend at a global brokerage firm. He even claimed the program had government backing, a lie so convincing none of us questioned it. Over the next few weeks, one by one, they all wrote checks. $50,000 from Mama's widow's pension, $300,000 from the inheritance Raymond had guarded for years. Naya wired $200,000 from her tech startup fund. My husband and I liquidated our savings, $150,000, to get in early. By the end of the month, nearly $5.2 million in family money was tied to Silver Bay. Victor beamed as if he had done us all a favor. "We'll be thanking ourselves in a year," he said. And we believed him, every word. It felt like the beginning of a new chapter. But in truth, it was the first page of a betrayal that would burn everything we had ever built. The next statement looked too good to be true, and it was. At first, everything about Silver Bay Capital seemed perfect, almost too perfect. Monthly statements arrived like clockwork, each more impressive than the last. Our family WhatsApp group buzzed with updates and excitement. "We're up 6.8% already," Aunt Beatrice would text, followed by celebratory emojis. Even Uncle Raymond, a man who never trusted anything beyond a savings bond, was calling Victor a genius. By the end of the third month, our collective investment had grown by nearly $800,000 on paper. Mama Amaka, who had always worried about outliving her pension, began daydreaming aloud about buying a small beach cottage for her retirement. Gabriel even floated the idea of opening a scholarship fund in his late father's name. It felt like the universe had finally decided to reward us for years of careful saving and sacrifice. Victor was the hero of every conversation. He'd strut into family dinners with that charming grin, offering insider updates about the company's partnerships. "We're expanding into Southeast Asian markets," he'd say over dessert. "You'll see the numbers double by next quarter." Everyone believed him, even me. After all, the results were right there in black and white. What none of us knew was that those glossy statements were a mirage. They weren't backed by legitimate investments, just recycled payouts from new recruits. Silver Bay wasn't a safe, high-yield portfolio. It was a sophisticated pyramid scheme, and Victor was closer to its center than he ever let on. Then came the Family Investment Summit, as Victor called it, a dinner where he suggested that we maximize our positions while the window was still open. More cousins joined in, some even borrowing against their homes. By the sixth month, over $8 million of family and friends' money was trapped in Silver Bay's web. By summer, family and in-laws alone sat at $11.8 million. With friends of friends, the victim pool we later traced in Discovery crossed $27 million. It was a tidal wave of wealth, on paper. But deep down, something in my gut began to whisper, "This is too good to be real." And that whisper grew louder the day I asked to withdraw a small amount, and was told I couldn't. "It's just a temporary hold," Victor said. But that was the first crack in the illusion. It started with something small, so small that most of the family brushed it off as nothing. I had requested to withdraw $20,000 from our Silver Bay account. We were planning to renovate the guest house on Mama Amaka's property, and I figured it was a reasonable test of the platform's promise. Withdraw anytime. No restrictions. Liquidity guaranteed. The response I got wasn't what I expected. "Due to unprecedented growth, temporary withdrawal limits are in place," the email read. "Your request will be processed in 90 days. 90 days. That wasn't any time, and it wasn't liquid. It was a stall. When I called Victor to ask about it, he laughed it off. "Nia, relax. he said over the phone, his tone dripping with reassurance. This happens when too many people cash out early. It's a good sign. It means the fund is growing. But that night I couldn't sleep. Something about his easy dismissal didn't sit right. I started combing through the original contract he'd given us. Buried in fine print was a clause about redemption windows, something he had never mentioned during his flashy presentation. And that wasn't all. The monthly statements we were receiving weren't coming from a major brokerage or bank as he'd claimed. They were PDFs generated from a Gmail account. I showed Gabriel. Doesn't this seem off to you? He shrugged. Victor knows what he's doing. Don't overthink it. But I was overthinking, because I remembered the stories I'd read online about Ponzi schemes that started exactly this way. The payouts. The delays. The excuses. Still, I said nothing. No one wanted to hear doubts when their portfolio had grown by 40% on paper. But deep inside, a cold, heavy feeling began to form, the kind that whispers you've made a mistake you can't undo. 3 weeks later, Victor announced a temporary freeze on all withdrawals, and that's when the panic began. Just as that knot of unease in my stomach was beginning to grow roots, an email arrived that would change everything. The subject line was simple, almost casual. Temporary pause on redemptions. Silver Bay Capital update. I opened it, heart thudding. The message claimed that unforeseen market conditions had forced the company to temporarily halt all withdrawals. It promised that operations would resume within the next quarter and assured investors that fundamentals remain strong. It even had Victor's signature at the bottom, along with a smiling photo of the Silver Bay team. I read the email 3 times. It didn't make sense. There was no mention of what those market conditions were. And what kind of pause lasted 3 months on a supposedly liquid fund? I called Victor immediately. Victor, what is this, a pause? You told us we could access our money anytime. He chuckled. Actually chuckled. Nia, this is how high-level investing works. It's called a redemption window. Big money can't move overnight. You worry too much. Worry? I snapped. There's nearly $8 million of our family's money tied up in this. People need that money for retirement, for mortgages, for school, and they'll get it, he interrupted sharply. You need to trust the process, but I couldn't. Not when Mama Amaka called that evening, her voice trembling, asking if her $50,000 was safe. Not when Naya told me she'd taken out a business loan against her $200,000 investment. And not when Uncle Raymond confessed that his entire retirement fund was now frozen in a pause no one had agreed to. The worst part? Victor wasn't panicking. He was celebrating. He'd just bought a new Mercedes, and there were rumors he was planning a trip to Dubai. Business is booming, he said at a family barbecue, raising a glass. We're just getting started. But behind every forced smile and raised glass, I saw the same silent fear in everyone's eyes. A fear that this pause wasn't temporary at all. 2 weeks later, the Silver Bay website went offline without warning, and Victor stopped answering our calls. 2 weeks later, the worst-case scenario we had all been trying to ignore slammed into us like a runaway train. I woke up to a dozen missed calls and a flood of panicked messages in the family group chat. The Silver Bay Capital website, the very site that housed our dashboards, statements, and projected earnings, was gone. Not under maintenance. Not temporarily unavailable. Gone. The URL returned a blank white screen and a 404 error. No contact numbers. No support email. The company's social media accounts had been wiped clean. And just like that, nearly $8 million of our family's money had evaporated into thin air. I called Victor over and over. Straight to voicemail. I sent texts, emails, voice notes. Nothing. Gabriel tried calling too, then Mama, then Naya. All of us desperate for an explanation. Hours later, Victor finally replied with a single message. Servers are being migrated. Calm down. Everything is fine. But everything wasn't fine. And that was the moment I stopped believing a single word out of his mouth. That evening, the family gathered at Mama Amaka's house, The atmosphere was electric, fear, anger, and disbelief thick enough to choke on. Aunt Beatrice was pacing the living room, muttering prayers under her breath. Uncle Raymond sat in silence, staring at the floor like he'd aged 10 years in a single day. Naya was on her laptop, frantically searching for any mention of Silver Bay Capital online. There was nothing. Victor swore this was safe, Mama whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. He promised us. I clenched my fists. Promises don't mean anything without proof. And proof was exactly what we didn't have. No legal documents, no regulatory filings, no verified business address. Everything we'd trusted was smoke and mirrors. For the first time, the unthinkable word slipped from someone's lips. Was this a scam? I didn't answer because deep down, I already knew the truth. 2 days later, Victor returned, not with answers, but with a chilling demand. Sign this non-disclosure agreement, and I'll help you recover your money. When Victor finally resurfaced, it wasn't with the apology or explanation we were desperate for, it was with a document. He appeared at Mama Amaka's house one evening, wearing expensive sunglasses and an even more expensive watch, like nothing had happened. His smile was still confident, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. I have a solution, he said, sliding a folder across the table toward me, but it requires cooperation. Inside were non-disclosure agreements, thick, intimidating legal documents drawn up by some high-powered law firm. The terms were simple but sinister. Sign the NDA, agree not to pursue legal action or speak publicly about Silver Bay, and he would personally assist in helping us recover some of the money. If we refused, he warned, the process would drag on indefinitely, and we might never see a cent. It was blackmail dressed up as a peace offering. You're asking us to stay silent while millions of dollars have vanished, I said, my voice trembling with anger. While people's retirements, homes, futures are gone. Nia, listen, Victor said, leaning forward, his tone shifting from charm to condescension. This isn't the time to get emotional. We all made choices. You included. I'm offering a path forward. You start calling regulators and you'll ruin any chance of getting your money back. Mama Amaka looked at me with pleading eyes. Maybe we should sign, she whispered. Something is better than nothing, but I shook my head. Something wasn't enough. Not when more than $8 million of family and friends' life savings had vanished into thin air, and the man responsible was still trying to manipulate us into silence. As I stared at Victor across the table, something in me hardened. This wasn't just financial ruin anymore. This was betrayal, calculated and cruel. And if he thought fear would keep me quiet, he was about to learn how wrong he was. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't signing anything. I was going to expose everything no matter the cost. That night, I didn't sleep a minute. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the NDA Victor had left behind. Every line, every clause was designed to silence me, to bury the truth and protect him from the consequences of what he'd done. The more I read, the angrier I became. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to sign, not now, not ever. When I told Gabriel, he looked torn. Nia, I hate this as much as you do. But what if he's telling the truth? What if this is our only way to get the money back? I shook my head. If Victor had any intention of returning the money, he wouldn't need to silence us first. He's covering his tracks, and I'm done helping him do it. That morning, I called Naya. We're going to find out exactly where our money went, I told her. If he's hiding something, I want proof. She didn't hesitate. I'm in. We started small, cross-referencing the few documents Victor had shared with us, searching company records, checking public filings. It didn't take long to realize Silver Bay Capital was nothing more than a shell. There was no registered office, no board of directors, no audited financial statements. Even the address on the brochure was fake. It led to an abandoned office suite in Lagos. The deeper we dug, the uglier it got. Payments from investors weren't going into Silver Bay accounts at all. They were being funneled through layers of shell companies, many of which traced back to Harbor Vista Consulting, a firm Victor owned outright. The evidence was damning. And it was just the beginning. I knew the moment I confronted him with what we'd found, everything would change. But I also knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. Victor had stolen our money. Now I was going to take back our power. Before I could confront him, Victor showed up at my door, and this time, he wasn't smiling. Victor showed up unannounced just after sunset, his SUV rumbling into our driveway like a warning. When I opened the door, he wasn't smiling. Gone was the charismatic family man who once toasted our future. In his place stood a man cornered, desperate, defensive, and dangerous. "We need to talk," he said, pushing past me into the living room without waiting for an invitation. I crossed my arms. "I have nothing to say to you." "Oh, but I have plenty to say to you." He paced slowly, eyes darting toward the folder of documents on the coffee table, printouts of wire transfers, company records, and shell accounts. "I know what you've been doing, Nia, digging around where you shouldn't." "I'm looking for answers," I said evenly. "We all are. You stole $8 million from your own family and friends. People trusted you." "Trusted," he said, sneering. "And they should again. You're about to make a mistake you'll regret. If you go to the authorities, no one gets a cent back. The platform collapses, lawsuits pile up, and guess who they'll blame first? Me?" I laughed bitterly. "I didn't set up the scheme, Victor." "You did, but you referred people. You helped promote it. Think a prosecutor won't love that?" His voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "If I go down, Nia, I'm taking you with me." For a moment, the room spun. His threat wasn't just a bluff. It was a calculated attempt to scare me into silence. But it didn't work. If anything, it confirmed everything I already knew. Victor was terrified. And scared men make mistakes. "Do whatever you need to do," I said finally, my voice steady. "Because I'm doing what I have to do." He leaned in close, his breath hot with rage. "Then may God help you," he hissed before storming out. As the door slammed behind him, I realized there was no turning back now. Victor had declared war, and I was ready to fight. The next day, an anonymous email arrived in my inbox, with evidence even Victor didn't know I had. The morning after Victor's threat, I woke up feeling like a storm was brewing, the kind you could sense even with the windows closed. I was still replaying his words over and over in my head when my laptop chimed with a new email notification. The sender was unlisted. The subject line, "You're not alone. Look inside." My heart raced as I hovered over the attachment, a zipped folder simply labeled Harbor Vista Files. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if this was some kind of trap, but curiosity and desperation won. I clicked inside were dozens of documents, internal emails, investor spreadsheets, and most damning of all, a series of wire transfer receipts showing exactly how the money had moved. There it was in black and white. Family deposits funneled straight into Harbor Vista Consulting, Victor's shell company, before being dispersed into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg. One memo, clearly written by Victor himself, detailed a referral compensation structure that paid him 12% of every family contribution, more than $900,000 in undisclosed kickbacks, but the most explosive file was a recording, a voice memo attached to an internal chat log. Victor's voice, unmistakable and smug, saying, "Family's money is the easiest money. They never read the fine print. They trust you blindly. That's the real return." I felt my blood run cold. That one line, "Family's money is the easiest money," shattered any illusion that this had been a simple business failure. It was deliberate, calculated, personal. I forwarded the files to Naya immediately. "We have him," I wrote. "We have everything." That night, I printed every document and organized them into a binder. It was more than evidence. It was ammunition. And now, Victor's threats didn't scare me anymore. Because I had something far more powerful. The truth. Just as I prepared to hand everything to the authorities, Mama Amaka called me in tears. Victor had told the entire family that I was the one who lost their millions. It didn't take long for Victor to strike back. By the end of the week, I received a frantic call from Mama Amaka. Her voice was shaky, as if she'd been crying for hours. "Nia, why would you do this?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "Victor says you're the reason we can't get our money back." "What?" I nearly dropped the phone. "What are you talking about?" "He told everyone you interfered with the company, that you panicked, started digging where you shouldn't have, and scared off potential investors. He said you froze the accounts. It felt like someone had poured ice water down my spine. In one masterful move, Victor had flipped the narrative, painting himself as the victim and me as the reckless troublemaker. By the time I arrived at the family meeting that evening, the damage was done. The living room was full of angry faces. Aunt Beatrice stood the moment I walked in. "How could you, Nia? Because of your paranoia, our money's gone. My retirement, gone." Nia tried to intervene. "That's not true. Nia found evidence." "Evidence?" Raymond scoffed. "What good is evidence if the accounts are frozen? If she had stayed quiet, maybe Victor could have fixed this." I looked at Gabriel, desperate for support, but he couldn't meet my eyes. Even he wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Victor arrived fashionably late, slipping in with a practiced sigh. "I warned you all," he said, shaking his head. "Regulators don't solve problems. They destroy opportunities. Nia's stubbornness might have cost us everything. It was a calculated performance, polished, persuasive, and venomous. And it worked. Within an hour, decades of trust crumbled. My family, the people I loved most, started to turn against me. But if Victor thought shame would silence me, he underestimated me. This wasn't over. And the next time we met, it wouldn't be in a living room full of whispers. It would be in a courtroom, under oath. I picked up the phone and made a call. Not to Victor, not to a lawyer, but to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. The night after the disastrous family meeting, I sat alone at my kitchen table, staring at the mountain of evidence spread out before me. Wire transfers, shell company registrations, emails, and that damning audio recording. My hands trembled, but not from fear. For the first time in months, I felt something different brewing inside me. Resolve. Victor had weaponized lies. He had turned the people I loved most against me. But now I had something stronger, the truth. And I was done playing defense. At exactly 9 a.m. the next morning, I dialed a number I had written down weeks earlier, but never had the courage to call. "FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, how may I help you?" I took a deep breath. "My name is Nia Okoye," I said, voice steady. "I have evidence of a large-scale investment fraud involving millions of dollars. The person behind it is my brother-in-law." The woman on the other end was calm and professional. She asked me to bring everything I had, documents, recordings, bank statements, even text messages, to their office the following week. "The more detail you provide," she said, "the faster we can act." For the next several days, I worked tirelessly with Nia to organize the evidence into a timeline. Every deposit, every payout, every fake update from Silver Bay Capital. We even mapped out Victor's offshore transfers, following the money trail from our accounts straight into his personal holdings. When I finally walked into the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit building, I carried 2 heavy binders and a USB drive that could destroy Victor's entire empire. "This," I told the investigator assigned to my case, "is how he stole from us. And I want to make sure he never does it to anyone else." The investigator glanced through the first few pages and nodded slowly. "Mrs. Okoye," he said, "you're about to open a very big case." A week later, Victor showed up at my door again, this time with a lawyer and a cease and desist letter, accusing me of defamation. I was pouring coffee the following Monday morning when a loud, impatient knock rattled my front door. My heart skipped. No one knocked like that unless they were angry or desperate. When I opened the door, there he was, Victor. But this time he wasn't wearing his usual smug smile. He was flanked by a tall, severe-looking man in an expensive suit, his lawyer. "Nia," Victor said coldly, his tone stripped of all family pretense. "We need to talk." I crossed my arms and stood in the doorway. "There's nothing left to say." The lawyer stepped forward, sliding an envelope into my hand. "This is a formal cease and desist order. You are to stop spreading defamatory statements about my client and Silver Bay Capital immediately, or we will pursue legal action for damages exceeding $10 million. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I refused to let them see me flinch. You're bluffing, I said, holding his gaze. Am I? Victor sneered. Because right now your claims are just that, claims. And without proof, you're the one who could go to jail for defamation. You'll lose everything. Your house, your savings, your reputation. The irony was almost laughable. He had stolen millions from our family and friends. He had lied and manipulated. And now he was trying to turn the law against me. You think you can intimidate me? I said calmly. You're terrified, Victor. And you should be. For a split second, his confidence cracked. Then he leaned closer and hissed, If you destroy my business, Nia, I'll destroy your life. I shut the door in his face. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from fury. As I stared at the cease and desist letter, one thought burned hotter than the rest. If they were willing to threaten me, they knew their empire was starting to crumble. That night, I emailed everything, every file, every document, every voice note, not just to the Financial Crimes Unit, but also to a journalist known for exposing white-collar scams. It was time to turn the light on. 3 days after Victor's failed intimidation attempt, the first article hit the newsstands. Family investment guru under investigation for multi-million-dollar fraud. The headline was plastered across the financial section of every major online outlet. The journalist I had shared the evidence with, a sharp, relentless reporter named Eliza Turner, had done her homework. The article laid out everything: the false guarantees, the Ponzi-like payout structure, the offshore accounts, and even the hidden referral commissions Victor had pocketed behind our backs. At first, I felt a rush of satisfaction, until my phone exploded. Dozens of messages and voicemails from relatives poured in, some furious, others terrified. Nia, what have you done? My cousin shouted. We could all lose everything if this goes public. You're ruining our family name, my aunt sobbed. How could you betray us like this? They didn't understand. I hadn't ruined anything. Victor had. I was just exposing the rot they'd all been too afraid to look at. Victor, on the other hand, was in full meltdown. He called 12 times that day. When I didn't pick up, he showed up outside my office, pounding on the glass doors until security escorted him out. Before leaving, he shouted something that sent chills down my spine. You think this is over? I still have friends in the commission, and I'll bury you. But he was lying, and we both knew it. Once the press picked up the story, regulators followed. The Financial Crimes Unit issued a formal subpoena for Silver Bay Capital's records. Bank accounts were frozen. Investigators began interviewing investors, not as witnesses, but as victims. For the first time, Victor was on defense, and for the first time, I felt the tide beginning to turn. Still, deep down, I knew the storm had only just begun. He had too much to lose, and desperate men are the most dangerous kind. The day after the article dropped, I walked into my parents' house for Sunday dinner, a tradition that once brought comfort but now felt like walking into a courtroom. The air was heavy, tense, and charged with unspoken accusations. My brother stood first. You've destroyed us, Nia. He spat before I could even set down my coat. Do you realize the bank is already calling about the retirement accounts? Do you have any idea what you've done? I didn't do this, I replied, keeping my voice steady. Victor did. He lied to all of you. He took millions from us, from friends, from cousins, and built his little empire on deception. But they weren't ready to hear it. My mother clutched her rosary and shook her head. We could have handled this quietly. Why involve the press? Why embarrass the family like this? I felt something inside me snap. Because quiet is how scams like this survive. Because he would have done it again, to someone else, if we hadn't stopped him. Silence fell, but it was the kind that cuts deeper than words. One by one, my relatives turned their backs, muttering under their breath. I was no longer the victim. I was the traitor. Only one person remained seated, Aunt Ngozi, the oldest and sharpest of us all. She tapped her cane twice before speaking. They're angry because they're ashamed, she said, her voice calm. You did the right thing, Nia, and when the truth is undeniable, they'll remember who had the courage to face it first. Her words were the first warmth I'd felt in days, and they reminded me why I started this fight. Not for their approval, but for justice. And justice was getting closer. I could feel it. 2 weeks later, the investigation exploded into full view. Subpoenas began arriving like a flood. To Victor, his company partners, even family members who had acted as regional ambassadors for the scheme. Every financial account linked to Silver Bay Capital was frozen. Emails, transaction records, and internal communications were demanded. And then one arrived for me. It was delivered by a federal agent in a navy blazer who spoke with polite firmness. "Mrs. Okoye," he said, handing me a thick envelope. "We need you to testify and provide all original materials you shared with the press and the Financial Crimes Unit. You may also be called as a key witness." My heart pounded as I read the notice. This was no longer a family dispute. It was a federal fraud case. The words Class B felony securities fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud jumped out from the pages. Victor wasn't just in trouble. He was in serious trouble. Meanwhile, his world was falling apart. Silver Bay's investors, now aware they'd been duped, formed a coalition and filed a $47 million class action lawsuit. Regulators from 3 different agencies launched parallel investigations. Even his personal accounts, including a luxury condo and 2 vehicles, were seized under asset forfeiture laws. Victor tried to call me again, this time with a pitiful tone. "Nia, listen, maybe we can work together on this. If you retract your statements, I can negotiate a deal. We can both walk away." I hung up without a word, because by then I had something far more powerful than anger: momentum. The legal machine was rolling, and it wasn't going to stop for anything. But deep down, I knew Victor wasn't going to surrender quietly. And sure enough, the next blow would be personal, and far more vicious than anything so far. Just when I thought Victor had been cornered, he shifted tactics, from financial manipulation to character assassination. It started subtly. A few anonymous posts appeared online. "Family feud leads to false accusations," one read. "Bitter sister-in-law tries to destroy legitimate business," claimed another. At first, I brushed them off. But within a week, it escalated into a full-blown smear campaign. Someone leaked my personal information online, my address, my job, even old photos from my university days. A fake Twitter account using my name started posting fabricated confessions about how I had manipulated evidence and coerced investors to turn against Victor. Even worse, a blog popped up claiming I had stolen money from the family inheritance and was trying to blame Victor to hide it. I knew exactly who was behind it. Then, one afternoon, my boss called me into his office. "Nia," he said carefully, "I received some disturbing emails about you. Anonymous, but they claim you're involved in a financial scam investigation. Is there anything I need to know?" The humiliation burned through me. Victor was trying to destroy my credibility, to make me look like the villain before the courts could expose him as the true criminal. I refused to back down. With the help of my attorney, I filed a defamation suit and handed over all the online evidence to the FBI. My lawyer explained that such campaigns often backfired. They showed intent to obstruct justice, which could add years to Victor's sentence. Still, the emotional toll was heavy. Family friends stopped returning my calls. Some relatives even believed the lies. But I reminded myself of the bigger picture. This wasn't just about my reputation. It was about the $47 million he had stolen and the dozens of lives he had shattered. And I wasn't going to let him win. The first pretrial hearing was supposed to be routine, just procedural motions and scheduling. But Victor had one last card to play, and he played it with a venom I hadn't thought possible. I arrived at the courthouse early with my attorney, dressed in a simple navy suit, trying to project calm I didn't truly feel. The courtroom buzzed with reporters, investors, and relatives. It was surreal to see so many faces I knew, some hostile, some sympathetic, many confused. Then Victor entered. He looked nothing like the arrogant, smooth-talking broker who once bragged about guaranteed returns. His expensive suits were gone, replaced by a plain gray one. But his eyes, sharp, cold, calculating, hadn't changed. As soon as the session began, his defense lawyer stood up and launched a bombshell. "Your Honor, we intend to submit evidence that Mrs. Nia Okoye, the prosecution's key witness, was herself complicit in the early stages of Silver Bay's operations. We will argue that she profited from the platform and is now attempting to shift blame." The room exploded into whispers. My hands clenched. It was a lie, but a dangerous one. Victor's lawyer presented old text messages, carefully edited, showing me discussing investment opportunities with friends. They were conversations from before I knew it was a scam, but stripped of context, they looked damning. "Objection!" my attorney shouted. "This is a blatant attempt to smear the witness with irrelevant and misleading evidence. The defense is grasping at straws." The judge ordered a recess to review the submission. I walked out of the courtroom shaking. Victor's smirk followed me the entire way. "He wants to drag you down with him," my lawyer said. "But this proves something important. He's terrified of your testimony. If we stay the course, we'll break him." I nodded, but inside I knew this was only the beginning of the courtroom war, and Victor was about to learn that I had far more evidence and far more allies than he ever anticipated. The courtroom stunt shook me, but it also lit a fire I didn't know I had. Victor wanted to twist the narrative and paint me as an accomplice? Fine. I would fight back with the one thing he couldn't manipulate, the truth. 2 nights after the hearing, I sat hunched over my dining table surrounded by boxes of documents, months of emails, contracts, investor statements, and digital ledgers I had painstakingly gathered since the day I realized Silver Bay was a scam. I wasn't just a witness anymore. I was about to become the whistleblower who blew this case wide open. The breakthrough came from a flash drive I'd received anonymously weeks earlier. It contained internal company chat logs from Silver Bay, unfiltered conversations between Victor and his co-conspirators. The messages were damning. "Victor, we need more capital inflow before payouts start failing. Keep pushing the family network. They trust me. They won't question it. Partner? And the referral bonuses? Victor, increase them. The more they bring in, the more they lose when this folds. They weren't just careless, they were criminal." I handed everything over to the federal prosecutors and, under advice from my lawyer, filed for whistleblower protection. That move granted me additional legal shielding and guaranteed the evidence would be central to the trial. When the investigators reviewed the flash drive, they found even more: offshore bank accounts linked to Victor, shell companies funneling money out of the country, and payments to political contacts to avoid regulatory scrutiny. The scale was far worse than anyone suspected. Nearly $68 million had been siphoned from investors, including elderly retirees and small businesses. The prosecutors thanked me personally. "This changes everything," one said. "We're no longer talking about fraud. We're talking racketeering, conspiracy, and money laundering." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something close to power. Victor had tried to silence me. Instead, I just handed the government the knife that could cut his empire to pieces. The deeper the investigation dug, the more explosive the fallout became, not just for Victor, but for the entire family. And this time, the battlefield wasn't a courtroom. It was the family itself. It started with a group call organized by my husband's parents, a desperate attempt to clear the air before the trial consumed everyone. I knew walking in that it would be a disaster, but I agreed to join. Maybe a part of me hoped someone, anyone, would finally understand why I was doing this. The moment my face appeared on the screen, the shouting began. "Nia, do you have any idea what you've done?" Victor's mother, Catherine, screamed. "Your obsession with revenge has destroyed this family." "Destroyed?" I fired back. "I'm not the one who stole millions of dollars and lied to everyone I love. Your son did that." Her husband slammed his hand on the table. "We were supposed to retire on those investments. That was our life savings. And now the government is freezing everything because of you. Because of Victor." I shouted louder this time. Because he lied. Because he took referral fees behind your backs. Because he knew it would collapse. The call spiraled into chaos. Cousins yelled about losing their homes. An uncle said his business had folded because he'd invested their payroll. And then Victor himself joined the call, calm, smug, and venomous. "Look at what you've done, Nia," he said smoothly. "You've turned everyone against each other. All because you couldn't keep quiet." I stared straight into the camera. "No, Victor. You did this when you decided that greed was worth more than family. I'm just the one who stopped you from doing it again." The screen went silent for a beat. And in that heavy silence, I realized something crucial. There was no going back. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a war for truth. And I was prepared to burn every bridge if it meant Victor paid for what he'd done. The next few weeks were a slow-motion implosion, not just of Victor's company, but of the carefully curated illusion he had built around himself. Piece by piece, the truth began to leak out, and with every revelation, his empire cracked a little more. The first blow came when federal regulators froze $12.4 million in assets linked to offshore accounts. Investigators traced them back to shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, all created under Victor's name. Next, one of his closest associates, a former marketing director, accepted a plea deal in exchange for testimony. Her statement was explosive. Victor knew from day one Silver Bay was unsustainable. He told us the goal was to keep new investors flowing until he could cash out. He called the family investors perfect marks. The phrase perfect marks hit the news headlines the next day. It spread like wildfire, igniting public outrage and drawing more victims out of the shadows. Class action plaintiffs doubled. More witnesses stepped forward. Even former employees, once loyal to Victor, now scrambled to distance themselves from the fallout. Inside the family, the cracks deepened too. His wife, Clarissa, filed for divorce after discovering he had funneled money into a hidden account under another woman's name. His parents quietly sold their home to cover legal bills, and investors he had once wined and dined now hurled insults at him outside the courthouse, calling him a thief and a fraud. The man who once strutted into boardrooms promising generational wealth now arrived in court surrounded by federal marshals, pale, trembling, and silent. And yet he still refused to accept responsibility. "This is all Nia's doing," he muttered to a reporter. "If she hadn't gone to the authorities, none of this would have happened." It was a chilling glimpse into his delusion, the refusal to see himself as the architect of his own destruction. But I knew better, and with trial day approaching, I was determined to make the final blow devastating. The day of reckoning was coming, and this time, he would be the one with everything to lose. The closer the trial got, the uglier things became, not just in the press or in court, but inside my own family. Victor had always been manipulative, but now he was desperate. And desperation made him dangerous. One afternoon, as I was leaving the attorney's office, I found my cousin Diana waiting by my car. Her eyes were red and puffy. "Nia," she hissed, "you're destroying this family." "Diana, I'm not the one who stole everyone's money," I replied calmly. "You could have handled this privately," she shot back. "Victor said the prosecutors were willing to negotiate if you'd just withdraw your statement. You're ruining all of us. Mom, Dad, even Grandma. She's sick over this." I swallowed hard. I knew Diana wasn't entirely wrong. Our grandmother had been hospitalized 2 days before. The stress had triggered a heart episode. And my parents? They were barely speaking to me. They said they understood why I was doing this, but every time I mentioned court, my mother's hands would shake. Victor had turned them all against me, painting himself as the victim of a witch hunt, a man who had made a mistake but didn't deserve prison. "Nia's gone too far," he told them. "She's doing this for revenge, not justice." The truth? It did hurt. I had loved this family with everything I had. I had trusted Victor like a brother. And now, because I chose the truth over silence, I was being cast out as the villain. Still, I refused to back down. "Tell Victor this isn't about revenge," I told Diana. "It's about accountability. And if he's innocent, he has nothing to fear in court." Her silence told me everything. Even she no longer believed his innocence. But loyalty is a powerful thing, and Victor was about to learn that it was also a fragile one. Just when I thought I had uncovered every possible piece of evidence, fate handed me something that would tip the scales entirely, a secret Victor never intended anyone to see. It happened late one night as I was reviewing discovery documents with my attorney, Ms. Castillo. Among thousands of financial statements, wire transfers, and encrypted emails, there was one file that hadn't been indexed properly, a digital ledger labeled simply Phase 2. At first glance, it looked like a standard investor list, but the deeper I read, the more horrifying it became. The ledger contained detailed breakdowns of projected income from future recruitment rounds, not investments, but people. Each name was tagged with phrases like target, likely to invest, or high referral potential. Even more damning, next to each name was a cut percentage labeled VF share, Victor's initials. He was planning a second-tier pyramid, Ms. Castillo murmured, scrolling through the document. This isn't just fraud, it's premeditated exploitation. But the real bombshell was on the final page, a section titled Internal Bonuses. It outlined over $3.8 million funneled directly into Victor's personal accounts through offshore subsidiaries. And worst of all, one of the accounts matched a number we had previously seen in a suspicious real estate purchase, a luxury penthouse in Dubai. I felt my stomach twist. Victor hadn't just lied to us. He had structured the scam to milk every last cent from his own family before expanding it to strangers. This, Ms. Castillo said, tapping the screen, is the nail in the coffin. It proves intent, premeditation, and direct profit. He can't claim ignorance anymore. I stared at the ledger for a long time. Every name, every dollar amount. They were proof that this wasn't a mistake. It was a plan, and it was about to bring Victor's empire crashing down in a courtroom he could no longer control. 2 weeks before the trial, when the case was already dominating the local news cycle, I received a call that changed everything. "Nia?" The voice on the other end whispered. "I need to talk." In person. It was Theo Choi, a former senior analyst at Silver Bay Capital, one of Victor's most trusted employees. I remembered him vaguely from a few family barbecues. He was polite, soft-spoken, and always seemed uneasy around Victor. Now his voice trembled with urgency. We met the next afternoon in a small cafe 2 towns over. Choi looked like he hadn't slept in days. "I can't keep quiet anymore," he said, sliding a flash drive across the table. "What's on this?" "It's everything. Emails, meeting notes, audio recordings. You need to give it to the prosecutors." "What changed?" I asked cautiously. "I was part of it," he confessed. "Not the scam itself, but the cover-up. Victor made us falsify reports, fabricate quarterly growth numbers, and delete investor complaints from the internal system. He said it was for optics, that it was temporary, but it wasn't. It was all lies." My heart pounded as he continued. "And there's more. Victor knew the platform would collapse within 6 months. He said he wanted the family's money in before that happened, so when it did, you'd all take the hit together." The recordings on that drive were devastating. In one, Victor could be heard laughing over dinner with a partner. "They'll never suspect their own family. And when it goes under, I'll already be long gone." When I handed the evidence to Ms. Castillo, her eyes widened. "This isn't just fraud anymore," she said. "This is a conspiracy. He's looking at decades behind bars." For the first time since the nightmare began, I felt the tide truly turning. Victor had built his empire on silence and manipulation, but now, the people he had once controlled were lining up to testify against him. And the fall was going to be spectacular. A few days after Choi's bombshell, Victor's attorney reached out to Ms. Castillo with what they called a last-ditch offer. Against my better judgment, I agreed to hear them out. We met in a sterile conference room at the courthouse, Victor on one side of the long mahogany table, his legal team beside him, and me on the other with Ms. Castillo. Victor looked nothing like the confident schemer he once was. The expensive suits and cocky grin were gone. He was pale, sweating, and jittery, but his eyes still burned with calculation. "Nia," he started, his voice surprisingly calm, "this has gone far enough. We both know a public trial will destroy the family. It will ruin our parents, tarnish our name, and drag everyone we love through the mud." I said nothing. I'd heard this speech before, a manipulator's version of an apology. "So here's what we're offering," his lawyer interjected. "A private settlement. Victor will pay back your full investment plus interest. In return, you withdraw your testimony and agree not to cooperate with prosecutors." Everyone walks away, quiet, clean. I glanced at Ms. Castillo. Her jaw tightened. "This is a desperation move," she whispered under her breath. I leaned forward and looked Victor in the eye. "And what about the millions stolen from our cousins? From Grandma's retirement fund? From the people you scammed outside the family? Are they part of your quiet plan too?" Victor's smile faltered. "This isn't about them. This is about us." "No," I said firmly. "This is about justice, and you don't get to buy your way out of that." The meeting ended with no deal. Victor slammed the table in frustration as we walked out. For him, this had never been about remorse, only damage control. But for me, it was about something far bigger, making sure he paid publicly for every lie, every betrayal, and every dollar he stole. And now nothing, not money, not guilt, not family, was going to stop me. 2 days after rejecting Victor's settlement offer, the moment we had been working toward finally arrived, the federal grand jury convened. Months of evidence, bank records, whistleblower testimony, investor statements, recordings, offshore transfers, and that devastating Phase 2 ledger were now in the hands of 12 ordinary citizens tasked with deciding whether there was enough to charge Victor and his partners formally. The atmosphere in the courthouse was electric. Reporters swarmed the steps, microphones extended like spears, shouting questions as I walked past. "Nia, do you believe Victor will face prison time? How much money was lost? Do you regret going public?" I kept my eyes forward. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about accountability. Inside, the hearing stretched on for hours. Choi testified first, detailing the falsified reports and the deliberate deception of investors. Then came forensic accountants, tracing every fraudulent transaction. And finally, the lead investigator, who confirmed the scheme had siphoned more than $27 million in total, with over $6.3 million funneled directly into Victor's personal accounts. The most damning moment, though, came when the prosecutor played one of the secret recordings. "We just need one more quarter," Victor's voice said, smooth and casual. "Once the family doubles their stake, we'll cash out and disappear. They'll never go after their own blood." The jurors' faces said it all: disgust, disbelief, and anger. By the end of the session, the decision was unanimous. Victor Adebayo and 3 co-conspirators were indicted on 42 counts, including wire fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement, and securities violations. When the indictment was read aloud, I felt tears sting my eyes. This wasn't just a legal milestone, it was the beginning of justice. The man who had gambled with our futures and mocked our trust would finally stand before a judge and jury. As Victor was led away in handcuffs for formal booking, he turned once to look at me. His glare was full of hatred and fear, the look of a man who finally understood he wasn't untouchable. The reckoning was no longer coming. It had begun. The indictment changed everything. Overnight, Victor's carefully manufactured image of a financial genius shattered, and with it, so did his support system. Investors who once idolized him now flooded social media with furious posts. Former allies distanced themselves publicly. Even his own defense attorneys hinted they might withdraw if he couldn't pay their retainer. But the most shocking moment came a week later at a pre-trial hearing, when Victor completely lost control. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, victims, family members, all watching as the prosecution laid out the terms of the case. Victor sat between his attorneys, but his composure was gone. He looked exhausted, his suit wrinkled, his hands trembling. When the judge denied his bail motion, citing flight risk and ongoing danger to investors, Victor snapped. "This is all a lie. he shouted, slamming his fists on the table. I built this company. I made everyone money. Nia is the reason everything fell apart, her and her damn accusations. The courtroom gasped. The judge banged his gavel for silence. Mr. Adebayo, control yourself or I will have you removed. But Victor wasn't done. He turned to face me directly, his voice dripping with venom. You think you're some kind of hero? You destroyed our family. You destroyed everything. I didn't flinch. No, Victor, I said quietly. You did. The bailiffs restrained him and escorted him out of the courtroom. And in that chaotic moment, I saw it clearly. The man who had once been so arrogant, so untouchable, was unraveling piece by piece. He was no longer the charming brother-in-law with big promises and confident smiles. He was a desperate, cornered criminal, terrified of the justice that was finally catching up to him. And deep down, I knew the worst was yet to come. The trial was looming. And when it began, every lie he'd ever told was going to be exposed, one piece of evidence at a time. The courthouse felt colder than usual that morning. As I walked up the marble steps with Ms. Castillo by my side, camera flashes erupted like lightning. The trial of Victor Adebayo versus the state had become national news. Headlines called it the family pyramid scandal and the $27 million betrayal. Inside, the air buzzed with tension. Rows of investors, many of them relatives, friends, and neighbors, filled the benches. Some avoided my eyes, still conflicted about what I had done. Others nodded at me silently, their faces etched with pain and hope. Victor entered minutes later in a dark gray suit and shackles hidden beneath the table. His once confident stride was gone. He kept his head down, jaw tight, as the judge called the court to order. The prosecution opened with a brutal summary. The defendant orchestrated a calculated, multi-year financial scheme, preying on trust, exploiting family ties, and knowingly destroying lives for profit. He did not make a mistake. He built a machine designed to enrich himself while leaving his victims destitute. They displayed charts showing the web of accounts Victor had used to launder money, timelines of false promises and screenshots of emails where he dismissed warnings as overblown. When the prosecutor played one of the secret recordings, Victor referring to us as easy marks, the room fell into stunned silence. Then it was the defense's turn. They painted Victor as a visionary entrepreneur whose company had failed due to market conditions. They claimed I was a disgruntled relative seeking revenge after losing money. But their narrative was weak, flimsy against the mountain of evidence. As I listened, I felt the weight of everything we had endured, the betrayal, the humiliation, the years of financial ruin. But I also felt something else, power. For the first time, Victor wasn't the one controlling the story. We were. In this courtroom with every word, every exhibit, every witness, was where he would finally face the full measure of what he'd done. The morning I took the stand, my heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. It wasn't fear, not anymore. It was the weight of everything I was about to say, everything I had carried for nearly 2 years. Please state your name for the record, the prosecutor began. Nia Okoye, I said, steadying my voice. And what is your relation to the defendant, Victor Adebayo? He's my brother-in-law, I replied. Or at least, he was before he stole everything from us. A quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom. I took a deep breath and started from the beginning. How Victor had presented himself as a financial expert. How he had insisted the platform was backed by government bonds. How he told us it was as safe as a savings account. I described the family meetings where we pooled our inheritance. The cousins who mortgaged their homes, the elderly relatives who drained their retirement accounts. All based on Victor's word. I told them about the $2 million my parents invested, the $750,000 from my cousin's college fund, and how in total, we had entrusted over $11.8 million just within the family. When the prosecutor showed the jury a copy of the hidden Phase 2 ledger, I watched their faces shift from skepticism to outrage. Then came the recordings, Victor mocking us, bragging about how family trust is the easiest money. Some jurors covered their mouths. Others glared at him. Finally, I was asked the hardest question. "Mrs. Okoye, how has this affected your life?" I swallowed hard. "We lost everything, homes, futures, relationships, and the man responsible sits right there, a man we once called family." Victor wouldn't meet my gaze. For the first time, he looked small, like the empire he'd built on lies was crumbling beneath his own feet. And in that moment, I knew. The truth was doing what money never could. It was destroying him. The next day, it was the defense's turn to question me. I had been warned it would be brutal, but nothing prepared me for the venom Victor's lawyer spat across the courtroom. "Mrs. Okoye," he began, pacing deliberately, "isn't it true that you chose to invest in Silver Bay Capital?" "No one forced you." "Yes," I replied calmly. "I chose to because I was lied to." "And isn't it true that you encouraged other family members to invest as well?" "I shared Victor's promises because I believed them." His voice sharpened. "So, in a way, you're just as responsible for their losses as my client, aren't you?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. My pulse quickened, but I refused to flinch. "No, I didn't create false reports. I didn't hide risks. I didn't pocket referral commissions behind their backs. He did." The lawyer's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Okoye, would you describe yourself as financially savvy?" "I would describe myself as trusting," I answered. And Victor exploited that trust. All of ours. When he realized I wouldn't crack, his questions grew desperate, grasping at irrelevant details, implying I had vendettas, suggesting I exaggerated losses. But the jury wasn't buying it. I saw it in their faces, a mix of anger and disbelief every time the defense tried to twist the narrative. Finally, the prosecutor stood to redirect. "Mrs. Okoye, if Victor had told you the truth, that the company was a pyramid scheme destined to collapse, would you or your family have invested?" "Absolutely not," I said firmly. None of us would have. The courtroom was silent as I stepped down from the stand. I had survived the storm, and Victor's defense strategy had collapsed under the weight of its own lies. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt victory wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. And Victor knew it too. His eyes followed me as I left the stand, cold, hollow, and terrified. The empire he built on deception was in its final days. When Theo Choi took the stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Quiet, precise, and visibly strained, he made the jury lean in. "Mr. Choi, please state your position at Silver Bay Capital," the assistant U.S. attorney began. "I was a senior financial analyst," Choi said. "I handled investor reporting, performance data, and internal projections." "Did Mr. Adebayo instruct you to falsify those reports?" "Yes," Choi said without hesitation. "He ordered us to inflate returns, hide losses, and delete investor complaints from the internal system. He said if we kept up appearances, we could buy time until new money came in." The AUSA displayed an email from Victor's account. "Make the growth chart look cleaner. No dips, no losses. If we keep the numbers smooth, they'll keep sending money." Choi confirmed he prepared several reports under Victor's direct instruction. Then, "Mr. Adebayo told us, quote, 'Family is our most reliable pool. They'll never suspect a thing.' What did he plan to do if the platform collapsed? He said he'd move remaining funds offshore and let the company die naturally. His exact words, 'Better they blame the market than me.' By the time Choi stepped down, Victor's defense was in tatters. His entire empire, from fake returns to his contempt for his own family, was now laid bare in sworn testimony. And with that, the final pillars of his story collapsed. The jury's faces told me everything. They didn't just think Victor was guilty, they knew it. If Choi's testimony had been the nail in Victor's coffin, the next witness, a forensic accountant named Dr. Tessa Caraway, was the hammer that sealed it shut. Calm, clinical, and devastatingly precise, she walked the jury through a labyrinth of bank transfers, offshore accounts, and money laundering operations, all leading back to Victor Adebayo. Over a period of 4 years, she began, projecting a flowchart of financial transfers onto a screen, Mr. Adebayo funneled $6.3 million of investor money into 5 shell companies registered in Belize, Panama, and the Cayman Islands. Those funds were then used to purchase luxury assets, real estate, vehicles, and even cryptocurrency wallets. The jurors leaned forward as she clicked through evidence, property deeds with Victor's name, encrypted account statements, and even invoices for a private yacht purchased under a corporate alias. And who controlled these accounts? The prosecutor asked. Mr. Adebayo directly, Dr. Caraway confirmed. No other individual had signatory authority. The defense tried to argue that the accounts were part of legitimate investment vehicles, but Dr. Caraway was unflinching. These accounts had no business activity, no product, no clients. Their only purpose was to conceal misappropriated funds. Then came the most damning slide. A single transaction log showing a $2 million transfer from the Silver Bay investor pool into one of Victor's shell companies, just days before the platform's collapse. Mr. Adebayo withdrew that money while publicly reassuring investors their funds were secure, she explained. The courtroom was silent. Even Victor's attorneys exchanged nervous glances. Every dollar he'd stolen, every lie he'd told, was now documented and exposed. By the time Dr. Caraway stepped down, the picture was crystal clear. This wasn't mismanagement or bad luck. This was premeditated theft on a massive scale. And there was no escape left for Victor Adebayo. The man who once promised generational wealth was now staring at the very real possibility of spending generations behind bars. By the time the prosecution presented its final piece of evidence, the courtroom had shifted from tense curiosity to stunned silence. Everyone knew Victor was guilty, but what came next erased any last shred of doubt. The prosecutor called FBI Special Agent Dominic Brooks, the lead investigator from the Financial Crimes Unit. He carried a small black device in his hand, a hard drive extracted from Victor's private home office. Agent Brooks, the prosecutor said, can you explain what's on this drive? Yes, Brooks replied. It contains dozens of voice memos Mr. Adebayo recorded for himself, notes, reminders, and strategy outlines. The judge allowed them to be played. The first clip echoed through the courtroom like a confession. Phase 1, family money. They're loyal, predictable, emotional. Easy. Phase 2, referrals, friends of friends. By the time the market dips, I'll have my exit lined up. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Victor stared straight ahead, jaw clenched as the prosecutor played another. Nia's starting to ask questions. Too many. Need to keep her calm. Maybe promise her higher returns or offer to double her shares. If she turns, the whole thing could collapse. I felt every eye in the courtroom shift toward me. Hearing my name in his own voice, cold, calculated, was a punch to the gut. And then, the final recording. If it blows up, blame the market, blame regulators, hell, blame Nia if I have to. Just never admit it was me. The courtroom gasped. Jurors exchanged looks of disgust. The defense team's faces drained of color. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecutor said softly, you don't need to take our word for it. You just heard the defendant admit to everything in his own voice. Victor slumped back in his chair. The swagger, the smirk, the arrogance, gone. All that remained was a hollow shell of a man who finally realized the game was over. The final blow had landed, and it had come from Victor himself. The closing arguments lasted nearly 6 hours, but they were the culmination of everything we had fought for. The prosecution's final words were sharp, deliberate, and devastating. This was not a failed business. This was a calculated betrayal. Mr. Adebayo didn't just steal money. He stole trust, futures, and dignity from the very people who loved him most. And he did it not out of necessity, but out of greed. Victor's defense tried to spin one last narrative, that he had been overambitious, that market forces had triggered the collapse, that he never intended to cause harm. But the jurors weren't buying it. Their faces had hardened long ago. When the judge finally sent them to deliberate, the entire courtroom held its breath. Hours ticked by. People paced the halls. My heart pounded with every passing minute. Then, just before dusk, The bailiff's voice echoed down the corridor. "The jury has reached a verdict." We filed back into the courtroom. The air was so thick with tension I could barely breathe. Victor sat stone-faced, hands clasped, his eyes flicking nervously between the jurors and the judge. On the charge of wire fraud, the foreman read, "We find the defendant guilty." On the charge of conspiracy to commit securities fraud, guilty. On the charge of embezzlement, guilty. Count after count, the word rang out, guilty, guilty, guilty. By the time the final charge was read, Victor's empire wasn't just broken, it was gone. A sob escaped from one of the investors behind me. My cousin squeezed my hand. I felt hot tears blur my vision, but I didn't wipe them away. They weren't tears of sadness, they were relief. Victor Adebayo, the man who had once called us easy marks, was now a convicted felon. And for the first time in 2 years, I felt justice wasn't just a word, it was real. The judge announced sentencing would follow in 2 weeks. Until then, Victor would remain in custody. As he was led away in handcuffs, he didn't look back. The man who once stole our futures now had none of his own. 2 weeks later, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Journalists lined the walls. Victims, many of them family, filled every bench. It was the final chapter of a nightmare that had consumed our lives. Today, Victor Adebayo would learn his fate. When he was led into the courtroom, he looked nothing like the man who once boasted about generational wealth. He was gaunt, pale and wearing a plain orange jumpsuit. His eyes darted nervously around the room but never met mine. The judge began by allowing victim impact statements. One by one, people stepped forward. A retired teacher who had lost her pension, a single mother who had been forced to sell her home, a cousin who had postponed his children's college plans. Their voices cracked with anger and grief, but they all shared a common refrain. Trust had been weaponized against them. Finally, the judge spoke. "Mr. Adebayo, your crimes were not a matter of bad business decisions. They were a deliberate betrayal of investors, of the public trust, and of your own family. You exploited relationships and manipulated faith for profit, and the consequences of your greed will echo for decades." The courtroom held its breath as the sentence was read. On 42 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement, this court sentences you to 38 years in federal prison, restitution of $27.4 million, and a lifetime ban from working in any financial capacity. A collective gasp swept through the room. Victor's knees buckled slightly as the guards gripped his arms. I didn't cheer. I didn't smile. But a wave of profound, quiet relief washed over me. It wasn't revenge. It was justice, the kind that didn't erase the pain but ensured he would never inflict it again. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I could finally breathe. Victor was led away without a word. The man who had once believed he was untouchable was now a prisoner, and the story he wrote in greed would end behind steel bars. The trial's end didn't magically erase the damage Victor had done. The money was still gone. The relationships were still fractured. And the scars, both emotional and financial, were deeper than I had ever imagined. But for the first time in years, there was a path forward. The restitution order set the wheels in motion. Federal agents began liquidating Victor's seized assets, the offshore accounts, the Dubai penthouse, the yacht, the crypto wallets, everything he had stolen. The process was slow, but over the next few months, small checks began arriving in the mail. It wasn't the full amount, but each payment was a symbol that justice had teeth. Meanwhile, the family tried to rebuild. My parents sold their house and downsized, determined to live within their means. My cousin opened a modest restaurant with what little he had left. Aunt Ngozi, who had always believed in me, hosted our first family gathering since the scandal, and for the first time, no one raised their voices. Some bridges, though, remained burned. My brother still refused to speak to me, blaming me for the shame Victor had brought upon the family. A few cousins cut contact entirely. At first, that hurt more than I expected. But over time, I realized that forgiveness wasn't a requirement for peace. Boundaries were. I started volunteering with a financial literacy nonprofit, teaching people how to spot scams and protect their investments. Sharing my story, our story, became a way to turn pain into purpose. And every time I warned a stranger not to trust someone just because they're family, I felt a little bit stronger. Life would never be exactly as it was before. But it would be honest, grounded, and real, and that was a kind of wealth Victor could never touch. The storm had passed. Now it was time to rebuild, slowly, deliberately, and on a foundation no one could steal. A year after the sentencing, I found myself standing on a quiet hill overlooking the same city where Victor once threw lavish investor parties, where he'd promised us a future of endless wealth. It looked different now, smaller, calmer, honest. So was my life. The last restitution payment had arrived 2 weeks earlier. It wasn't much, pennies compared to what we'd lost, but it was enough to close the legal chapter. Victor was now a number in the federal prison system, serving out a sentence he'd never escape. The news occasionally reported on his appeals, all of them denied. His name had become a cautionary tale in business schools and regulatory briefings, a story of greed devouring itself. And me? I had changed too. The betrayal that once defined me no longer controlled me. I had rebuilt slowly, emotionally, financially, spiritually. I had bought a small home. I'd started a consultancy helping victims of financial fraud. And more importantly, I'd found peace in the fact that truth had prevailed. One afternoon, as I was packing up files, I received a letter. Handwritten, shaky, but unmistakably his. Victor. Nia, I know I can never undo what I did. Prison gives you a lot of time to think. I hope someday you can forgive me. Not for me, but for you. I stared at the page for a long time. Once, those words might have enraged me. Now, they simply felt distant. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Not forgiven, not forgotten, but finished. Walking away from that chapter wasn't easy. But as I closed my office door and stepped into the warm sunlight, I realized something profound. Victor had stolen our money, our trust, and our peace, but he never stole my resolve. And in the end, that was the greatest justice of all. This wasn't a story about wealth lost. It was about power reclaimed and the quiet strength of refusing to be a victim ever again. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it. If you have a unique story of your own, share it in the comments below. Thank you for listening.